We can get going. So welcome to the Maison Française for this evening's event. We are here to discuss two important recent contributions to transnational French and North African history and cultural studies. So Todd Shepard's Sex, France, and Arab Men, 1962 to 1979, published by Chicago in 2017, and Mehammed Mack's Sexagon, Muslims, France, and Sexualization of National Culture, published by Fordham in 2017. So the publication of these two books within a few months of each other provides a rich opportunity to reflect on the complex ties linking discourses on sexuality to those on race, religion, the legacies of immigration and decolonization, especially the violent and painful separation of France and Algeria. The two books we'll be discussing tonight both explore these intersections, but in different ways. They cover different historical periods. Sex, France, and Arab Men explores the decade and a half between Algerian independence and the Iranian Revolution. It argues that the figure of the Arab man was central to discourses and debates of the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s, that it was invoked, albeit in very different ways, by groups ranging from the far right to gay liberation movements and feminists. Sexagon, in a way, picks up where Sex, France, and Arab Men leaves off, though it focuses on most recent periods from the 2000s and 2010s. It argues that France's national borders have increasingly been defined and enforced by the policing of attitudes to gender and sexuality, hence the title Sexagon. But it's not just a book about discrimination, it's also a book about solidarities. These two books together complement existing work on gender and sexuality in Orientalism and colonial and post-colonial contexts by shifting the focus from women, especially the figure of the veiled woman, to men. I think both books and the two books taken together show the importance of historicizing in the sense that they reveal very significant shifts, both in categories, in ways of naming people and practices, and in attitudes. So I'm delighted to welcome both authors to present and discuss their work. They're both familiar presence at the Maison Française, so I'm going to make my introduction short. So Todd Shepard is Arthur O. Lovejoy Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. His first book, The Invention of Decolonization, the Algerian War, and the Remaking of France, which was published in 2006, had a transformational impact on colonial and post-colonial historiography. It won both the American Historical Association's 2006 J. Russell Major Prize and the Council of European Studies 2008 Prize for the Best First Book. It has since been translated into French. Todd is also the co-editor with Patricia Lorson of a 2016 collection of essays, French Mediterraneans, Transnational and Imperial Histories, and of a second collection, Guerre d'Algérie, Le Sexe ou Trajet, co-edited with Catherine Brun. He is currently working on Affirmative Action and the End of Empires, Integration in France, 1956 to 1962, and the Race Question in the Cold War World. And he's preparing a new edition of James F. Macmillan's 20th Century France textbook for Bloomsbury. Mehammed Mack is assistant, but very soon to be associate professor at Smith College. In addition to Sexagon, he is the author of several articles, and he is a regular contributor to The Funambulist, Al Jazeera English, and Weekly News. Mehammed is working on a new book project tentatively titled Euradia, Visions of Reverse Crusades and Counter-Colonization in Contemporary European Culture. So before joining the faculty at Smith, Mehammed completed a PhD in French and Comparative Literature at Columbia. History supervisors are here tonight. No pressure. Myself, Professor Emmanuel Sada, Professor Joseph Massad. I think it's fair to say that we're all very excited and a little bit proud in the appearance of your book.
And Todd himself was on the committee. It's more of us.
Yes, that's true. So thank you for being here. Welcome. So we talked about having each of you present your books for about 15 minutes, starting with Todd, since that makes most sense chronologically, and then we'll have you maybe talk to each other a little bit and open things up for discussion.
Thank you so much. This Maison Française has been really important to me, and the last time, I've been here several times since, but one of the really exciting times, and then a lot of the development of what became this book, was a presentation I did here that was linked to there was time to connect, at least on the same day, with Mo's dissertation defense. So I'll kind of give you just a brief overview of the book. I was told 20 minutes, but I'll try to aim for 15. And yes, so let's see if this works too. I know the word, whether or not. Okay, so in May 1977, which is kind of at the end of the period that I'm looking at, 62, 79, Libération, so the left-wing daily newspaper that had been founded, or at least famously founded by Jean-Paul Sartre and others on the left, published a long letter which began with a strong thesis. Quote, "The reputation that the Arab suffers of a man whose sexual organ cuts like a knife is nothing less than a systematic aggression against him." End quote. There were 6 signatures after it, attached to it 5 male names and that of 1 woman. And their names also indicated, to most readers at least, other differences, as half of them read as Maghreb. Mustafa Jajem, Ali Ghanem, who's also known as Ali Ghanem, by and Mohamed Zemmouri, alongside Jean Duflo, Pierre Bohan, and Jacqueline Nancy. Let's just point out, I'm not going to talk about this, but all of these are members of this, are involved in French cinema. The first 3 names in important ways. La Rabu Sex Couture, their striking image, foregrounds well-British linkages. Between the Algerians and the French was a knife, was how the philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis put it. And that knife, it sums up the French imaginary as it concerns Maghrebis, particularly Algerians, at once in terms of murder and in sexual terms, end quote. The beachside encounter in The Stranger by Albert Camus, of course, which depicts Rousseau taking out his phallic pistol to murder the so-called Arab, whose phallic knife blade glints in the sun, is one particularly vivid example of this association. The correspondents went on to critique how an earlier letter to the editor, to which they were responding, had relied on a depiction of the supposed banality of the Arab homosexual, end quote. Their analysis emphasized how this was, quote, described as a dangerous and powerful institution, in the proper sense of the term, a cruel bugger, enculeur, end quote. It was a rare moment in 70s French discussions. The term cruel enculeur located the identities Arab and homosexual in the same person. Even as it suggested in the larger article, their letter, that there could be distinctions between gay, homosexual, and non-homosexual Arab men, and that they were also linked to this vision of cruel enculeur, and also focused on a particular act and a relationship to a particular sexual act, cruel enculeur, as synonymous with that dual identity, Arab, homosexual. Here, Jajem, Ghanem, Zemmouri, and their co-authors extended the importance of their claim, quote, "Yet we know what this stereotype obscures." This is one of those kind of rare moments when you're doing a lot of archival work, every time you come up with an argument or a thesis of what I think is happening in this period, where this letter, I think, that comes out near the end of the period, just has so much density and identifies so much. And it's just almost, I didn't see anything else like it. I saw a couple other pieces which I'll also briefly talk about today, that did that kind of captured this intersection of different themes and questions that I was really interested in. But this one really marked me. And this is why I wanted to begin with this, which is the center of a chapter that I have on the question of what I call the sodomy vogue of the 70s. But I wanted to begin with this in order to map out some of the key arguments I make in my new book. So this is the book. It came out in French last year, and it just came out here a few months ago. And its central argument is that Algerian questions and answers made the sexual revolution French. It's a history of how and why, from Algeria's independence from France, after 132 years of conquest and occupation, which happened in 1962, and through the cultural and social upheaval of the 1970s, highly sexualized claims about so-called Arabs And I'm not going to keep doing this, and the book doesn't either. There is an explanation of why, but you should, if you want to, you should imagine I'm doing air quotes. Were omnipresent in important public discussions in France, both those that dealt with sex and those that spoke of Arabs. Two phenomena became enmeshed. The ongoing consequences of the Algerian War, which had erupted in 1954, again after more than 12 decades of French colonial rule, and lasted for 8 bloody years, and the so-called Sexual Revolution, which over the course of the 1960s and 70s grabbed public attention, rapidly changed how sex was discussed, evoked, lived, and far more slowly changed even how it was legislated. Even as it also provoked critique, activism, and resistance. To understand each, that is, it is necessary to analyze them together. What this juxtaposition of the war's aftermath and revolution render visible, I think, are certain ways that the fight for sexual liberation, which is usually explained as a US and European invention, also developed out of the worldwide anti-colonial movements of the mid-20th century. Now, obviously, I hope my work is really derived, kind of speaking from this important discussion that was sparked by Edward Said's Orientalism, this question of sexual Orientalism in particular. Now, famously, Said talked relatively little, quite little, in fact. There's the cover of the dancing boy, but very little about questions of sex. And one of the things that I would suggest, I'm working on this now for a small paper, is that we can see of this in some ways as a form of resistance, a resistance to kind of this constant assault that the letter writers evoked, in the quote that I began with, on Arab men, or people identified as Arab, in France and elsewhere in the late 1970s. But this incredibly important discussion of this one aspect of Orientalism, that is so-called sexual Orientalism, is something that, of course, is very visible in the work that I'm doing here. One of the key distinctions, as Madeleine raised earlier in this project and what I found in the 60s and 70s, is that it's almost the most important figure here is male rather than female. And again, this is quite atypical historically. And in that kind of binarization of male rather than female, it's also the hyper-virile male rather than the effete or the effeminate male. And again, or the boy, the Arab boy. And again, like male and female, the typical figure of the male in sexual Orientalism is always extremes, right? So it's usually these two extremes. Like there's always philo-Semitism, there's always anti-Semitism, this extreme that no one can simply be normal, no one can simply be part of a large spectrum of the ways that different people are. This vision of the Arab depends on these extremes, and here the extreme that was very omnipresent was this form of hyper-virility rather than the effete. So I found very little of that particular figure, which has been widely discussed. Another key difference, of course, is that the developments and discussions here, this is what really sparked the book, were both continuous in many ways with sexual Orientalism, but happened after formal empire had ended. And these discussions took place almost exclusively about things happening in France, or at least that's what I trace out, even as they always also referenced Algeria. So again, the term Arabs is supposed to signal a whole bunch of different things it did at the time period too. But one of the things the book really wants to explore is how in these French discussions, the constant reference point was to Algeria. In this period, the 60s and 70s, it's a period that I term the period of post-decolonization. So I'm using this instead of post-colonial, but chronological category that I think we can talk about if we want to. But post-decolonization, invocations of sex and Arabs then were about these people, these relationships, these events located within France that referenced Algeria. These discussions churned through what I refer to as Sexagon, diverse references to sex, sexual morality, deviance, and normalcy that appeared in public publications, archived documents, visual sources. So again, I'm looking at a category of evidence rather than trying to explore a discourse around sexuality. Talk of sex as a way to access something else. And in particular then, this aftermath of the Algerian War, of the Algerian Revolution, and the longer history of colonialism. This is a project then that developed, took me quite a long time to really figure out how to do. My first book was really focused on types of archival sources that were heavily produced, almost or overwhelmingly produced by French government sources in bureaucratic archives, in state sources, the stuff of high politics as well as institutional politics. And I was trained and really worked to look at that material in ways that were informed by culturalist critiques and cultural critics. But but was not myself really that type of person. So getting ready, feeling comfortable enough to grapple with the type of material that anchors this book, which are heavily cultural, both in various forms, was something that took me a while to feel comfortable with. I mean, I did end up finding a lot of archival material as well, but that's something that I'm quite pleased with, is how I was able to kind of move away from some of the more limited forms of historical analysis to do something a little bit different. And the way that I wanted to talk about this and try to do so in the book is to argue that this post-decolonization grammar of sex talk changed contemporary France. The claims, of course, range from fascination to reprobation. In 1962, the essayist Edward Politi asserted that, quote, "It is usually agreed in France that Arabs have been gifted with greater manliness than us," which the author linked, of course, to their more primitive social organization. The tension this quote highlights between gifted and primitive aptly announces the contradictory ways that assertions about Arab men moved over the following years. What remained constant, of course, and I suggested this already, was an affirmation of stark difference, which opened some possibilities, even as it closed far more. Many scholars, of course, have claimed that until the 1990s, French public discussions and public debate avoided grappling with France's long history of racism, of colonialism, and in particular the dehumanizing effects of the Algerian War. In attending to sex talk, revealed to me, and I think reveals to other people now, that many French people could and did debate racism and the suffering that colonialism and decolonization inflicted. And again, this kind of tails off around 1979, or at least that's the argument of my book, for around a decade or so. Over the course of the 60s and 70s, many critics rejected the accusations of sexual perversion leveled at Arab men in France. Maghreb authors were particularly attentive to this multi-pronged assault. In his Les Ambassadeurs, the Tunisian director Nasser Qatari offered a crude summary of some of the key stereotypes at play. This 1975 feature-length film starkly depicted the difficulties faced by the immigrant workers, who had become such a visible feature of contemporary France. The film was directly inspired by the October 1971 murder in the poor and heavily Maghrebi Goutte d'Or neighborhood of Paris of Jalali Ben Ali, a 15-year-old Algerian boy who died at the hands of Daniel Pigeot, the jealous and racist concierge who lived in his building. Pigeot was convinced that the boy had slept with his wife. One scene in the film, so here we have a protest with people like Michel Foucault, Jean-Paul Sartre. It's a moment that sparked much debate and discussion in France, particularly on the far left, this murder. One scene in the film that came out several years later depicts a group of concerned, white, so-called French inhabitants who have gathered together thanks to the activism of a far-right hotel owner. Stirred to anger, they list the problems they have with the behavior of their Arab neighbors. All relate to sex. Yeah, all related to sex. These are them, they follow our women, are ready to rape them, they're all faggots, they'll sleep anything, even goats. There are several that come on to me. As my work confirms, this almost comical melange of seemingly contradictory actions and inclinations captures the intensity and depth of animating prejudices. Now, some radical critics were looking to do other things with this discussion of Arab men than simply reject accusations of perversion. Roditi's 1962 essay, for example, twinned descriptions of Arab and what he called Muslim societies as primitive with the qualification less neurotic. It paralleled what he characterized as their sort of healthier approach to male sexuality with that of ancient Greece. Again, there's nothing particularly surprising here. But he did so to an end. This French-born American of Turkish Jewish descent, American literary art critic, meant to critique anti-homosexual laws that had just been voted in France, particularly the 1960 social plague law. And here again, it's a dense source that really links the institutionalization of this law, the first time that the word homosexual ever appeared in a French law, the first time that the word prostitute, so that with the institutionalization with the 1960 context of the Algerian War itself, the French claims that Algeria should be considered wholly French. Other writers had somewhat different purposes. After May 68, celebrations of Arab men as a source of political inspiration increased among many left-wing commentators. Leftists spoke of a liberatory freedom in forms of political activism, particularly what they called Arab, Muslim, or Maghrebi actors and militants. France, the West, and in particular those who wanted to start a revolution, had much to learn from this model. Of course, the victory of the Algerian Revolution was one of the key reference points here. But there were other reference points to this revolution that had kicked out through violence a Western oppressor, a Western capitalist country, defeated them. But there was also, of course, the Palestinian Revolution that was seen as ongoing, questions about the Western Sahara, the ongoing influence of Nasserism, a whole set of discussions then that linked up to this idea that there was an Arab revolution, that there was something specific to what was happening in the Arab world that could provide a new impulsion to revolutionary aspirations. So what they're doing here then is insisting that this form of Arab difference, this stereotype, I want to emphasize, of the so-called Arab, the Arab man in this case, as an incarnation of this Arab revolution. It is a limiting stereotype, but one of the intriguing things is that unlike other kind of the classic other forms of Islamophilia or Arabophilia, this one is explicitly political. So it's distinct from the usual model of sexual Orientalism in its kind of admiring frame, which is, of course, Oriental despotism. Here, the Arab Revolution proposed that there was a particular political valence that could be invested in by many leftist observers was, I try to show, in the Arab man as heir to and embodiment of this revolutionary possibility. So for example, in 1978, an author, a pseudonymous author, wrote what he called, in speaking of groups like the Homosexual Front for Revolutionary Action, but other revolutionary movements in the 1970s, he said, among the avant-gardes, not a scrap of pseudo-sexolutionary writing didn't speak of Arabs, as if to hug close the FLN, the National Liberation Front, an FLN that they never knew. With the virtual disappearance of these claims by the late 1970s, the period that I'm looking at comes to a close. The public conversation about Arabs, of course, was not restricted to the far left. It went far beyond. The active interest, notably of far-right and right-wing voices in these questions, reminds us, I think this is important, that such recriminations, such forms of attack, such accusations, were not simply popular prejudice. They didn't simply emerge full-born from the past. They were propagated. There were active efforts to impose them. In November 1978, after multiple art house cinema screenings of Qatari's Les Ambassadeurs, it was shown on one of France's most popular television shows in prime time, the Dossier L'Écran, reports from the big screen. In response to this public television showing of the film, the editor of the far-right journal Minute, the weekly newspaper, offered an alternate depiction of the scene that I evoked earlier, of the concerned Frenchmen and French women, whose meetings Qatari had filmed. The writer ironically defended, quote, those Frenchmen so profoundly abject, they're incapable of joyously embracing the transformation of their neighborhood into a casbah. He evoked, quote, those heartless Frenchmen, so full of themselves, that they dislike the stench of Arab cuisine, filling the streets, the noise of Arab music, the presence of an overly large Arab minority taking up the seats of the schools their children attend. He added one final element to this chain of stereotypes, and it was the most important. The rejection by those Frenchmen of what the ultranationalists termed, quote, the vigor of Arab sexuality. The right tone, of course, presents each element in this long list of worries as comprehensible, self-evident. Most of his concerns focus on the external, on infringements on French sensibilities and senses, smells, sounds, yet this last, right after he summoned images of children in schools, located the problem as a difference in kind, something inherent to the Arab man, which meant his intimate boundaries, French families, perhaps the nation. The supposed sexual threat that Arabs posed to the French was foundational, I try to show, to post-62 far-right efforts to re-enter mainstream discussions. All of the importance in this group of French far-right people had joined with the secret army organization to use terrorists and try to stop the Algerian war, try to stop Algerian independence, and few of them after 62 repudiated these efforts. But so here's one of them, so this kind of pushed them way to the outskirts of French life for quite a while. It's not until after 1979, of course, with the National Front, that they'll really re-enter public political life in terms of electoral politics. But this form of what Gramsci and following Gramsci, far lesser level, the new right thinker Alain de Benoit terms metapolitics, of changing the terms of the discussion, was something that the far right had a lot of success in. So again, here's something, a poster that reappeared, a term that reappears, Mehammed Mack, that will reappear in films like Du Bon La Joie, that will reappear in National Front political campaigns in the early 1980s. Linking the Arab man, linking the Arab invasion, as they would call it, to forms of sexual aggression. So I'm interested in this discussion, this back and forth between a far right-wing vilification, a kind of reinvestment of the typical forms of sexual realism, of typical forms of Arab lust, of Muslim violence, of aggression on the one hand, and this left-wing reinvestment of forms of, again, classic forms of Arabophilia in political terms, attempting to make this a model of how revolution could happen, how this back and forth shaped discussions that were central to the sexual revolution, so-called in France, made them in many ways, I want to suggest, French. It's what distinguished them in many ways from discussions that were happening elsewhere, in places like the US, the UK, or Germany, happening often with similar chronologies. What was distinct in particular about the French debates then, the French sexual revolution, was this fixation, this point of fixation around the so-called Arab man that changed discussions, that changed their form, and in some ways changed their content too. But I think in looking at this period, we get a new sense of what the sexual revolution made possible, and also its limits, by really focusing in particular on the important role of those who rejected the sexual revolution, ardently rejected it. I focus on social Catholics, for example, who were afraid of promiscuity and linked it to Arab pimping and Arab frequenting of prostitutes, but also to the far right, who they ardently rejected, to show that there's more to the sexual revolution than simply something liberatory. This is not simply the completion of desires or allowing desires to be free. This is something that has a dense and complicated story behind it. And I think focusing on both sides of this, and particularly focusing on this racial anchoring, this anti-Arab or this fixation on Arabs as different, as something that could be particularly explanatory to helping people at the time think sexual revolution, gives us a somewhat different view of this, even as it also allows us to remember how centrally, how post-Algerian French history is in this period. As I've tried to show briefly again by citing authors like Zemmouri, Ghanem, like Qatari, and I try to do this repeatedly in the book as well, there were a number of people, Maghrebi men in particular. I also look at people of like Leila Sabah and a few other voices. They too were even more infrequent. People tried to speak out. They said really interesting things. This has been erased again from the story. So this story of how that history has been forgotten, of how this intense discussion of racism and colonial violence has been forgotten, I think has much to say to the discussions today. Or at least I try to kind of touch on some of those at the end.
Thank you, Todd. So, Mehammed.
Okay. Just going to start up my time. So I'm really, really happy to be back here where I have so many memories, and 4 out of 5 people are here in the dissertation defense committee. Only Sexagon is not here, but I'll tell her about it. I thought I would start just by telling you a little bit about the book's argument and the chapter, give you a chapter breakdown. And then I want to go a little bit more into the story about this cover image and the person whose face we can't see. But I'll tell you all about it. The argument I make in the book is that in current immigration debates in Europe, sexuality has been politicized in a certain way. So whereas prior, the integration of candidates for naturalization was judged according to civic aptitude or knowledge of the language or things like that, I was suggesting increasingly that it was all about having the right set of attitudes about gender and sexuality. And I look at that in the cultural arena. This process of sexual humanization suggesting that Arabs have a special kind of sexual intolerance, that Muslims also have this same sexual intolerance. I look at how this happens in the cultural arena, and specifically through cultural chauvinism, or kind of patriotism that uses culture as a form of defense. So I look at 5 different fields, and these correspond to the chapters. The first chapter is about anti-sexism and anti-discrimination activists and the work they do in the banlieue, the multi-ethnic suburbs that surround major French cities, and specifically the suggestion that somehow women and homosexuals in the banlieue are at a distance from the sexual liberation of women and homosexuals in the city center. and that they can never be queer in a certain sense, and that they're always on the receiving ends of lessons about queerness, but can never themselves queer anything or offer queer lessons about anything. So I actually look at fashion design and street style as kind of fields that offer counter-narratives to that idea, because I show how prominent French fashion designers have constantly borrowed from the stylings of French sexual minorities who come from the banlieue. And I also use avant-garde film to make that counter-argument. Second chapter talks about psychoanalysis, and specifically a conservative strand of psychoanalysis, which is often visible in op-ed pages in major French newspapers, which talks about the impact that immigration will have on sort of the symbolic order or relationships, the relation between the sexes, and how a certain kind of harmony between the sexes has delicately been put in place and is threatened by the arrival, the massive influx of migrants from lands where, you know, the killing of the father might happen differently, or where relationships between the family members that make up the traditional bourgeois family or the Freudian family unit might be different. And I specifically talk about how these psychoanalysts compose something broken, namely a broken family. They are instrumental in constructing a broken, dysfunctional family made up of a self-censoring or veiled mother, an impotent, unemployed father, and a juvenile delinquent. And all these three figures have been heavily psychoanalyzed in the media and so other social science literature. The third chapter talks about literature, and specifically interethnic and interracial relationships in literature. And I look at the trope of the Arab boy. So the Arab boy is a trope that stretches from pre-decolonization, travel literature, some might even call it sex tourism literature, and continues on into sort of post-colonial touristic literature that not only addresses the post-colony, but also the French banlieues as a kind of extension of the post-colony. So I look at how this figure of the Arab boy goes from being servile to being difficult, resentful, and to sort of having a reckoning of a sexual nature with interlocutors, French white interlocutors in the present. Fourth chapter is about cinema, and I was specifically interested in how the cinematic, oh my god, I didn't even show you the cover of the book. Okay, so this is the cover of the book. You haven't missed anything, I didn't miss any slides, I'm going to get to it later, okay? Where was I? The fourth chapter. It's about cinema, and specifically I was interested in how this, the camera, the cinematic apparatus, is used to pry into the private lives of immigrants and Muslim minorities, specifically to unearth and expose a kind of hypocrisy regarding their sex lives, and having a double life and how they have a different relationship to the public-private distinction. I was also interested in how sensitively some auteur and avant-garde filmmakers portray privacy on screen and respect this privacy in a difficult way for cinema, which is kind of designed to expose things. The fifth chapter, and this is a chapter that I chuckle about because I think when we were having discussions about it, it's kind of a racy chapter because it's about pornography, and I thought I would get away with calling it erotica, but now that I know that erotica and pornography are very different, and so I'm not trying to hide anything anymore, and I have tenure now, so I can just tell you what it's about. Okay, so my idea was that pornography, although highly exploitative and highly problematic in many ways, I was interested in how French ethnic pornography, both heterosexual and homosexual, was grappling with all the major flashpoints in the contemporary French immigration debate, and not just grappling with them, but exacerbating these tensions and offering what were thought of as kind of therapeutic solutions to these problems through a kind of sexual reconciliation. So I was also trying to argue, kind of with my cultural studies hat on, that pornography is very important as a cultural commodity. It's something that people consume more pornography than books. And there's a lot of sort of suggestive messaging and implicit, you could even say thought control or thought suggestion that happens through pornography. And I wanted to trace actually how pornography was being taken very seriously by avant-garde filmmakers and performance artists. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So you might recognize this person's back from the cover of this image. It's a film poster, a film by Christophe Honoré, who is one of the most renowned French gay film directors. And the person here is an adult film actor by the name of François Sagat. He is himself, he says he has French and Slovakian origins. And he said that he was inspired all throughout his life by Arab culture. And he has always admitted in interviews that he's Caucasian. But when he first came onto the scene, he actually performed under an Arabic stage name, which is Izzat-Din or Azadin in the French pronunciation, which means glory or esteem of religion. So you might notice also, I don't know if you can tell from the image, that he has a tattooed scalp. This is a new revolution in hair replacement technology, which is designed to sort of conceal a receding hairline, but is also reminiscent of Caesar cuts or other barbershop cuts, which you see not only in Puerto Rican or Dominican barbershops, but also in France, because there's a lot of borrowing from sort of New York street style, New York styles of self-fashion. He also has another tattoo, which is the most noticeable one, a giant Islamic crescent on his back, which is extremely noticeable in the pornographic sequences, because usually he takes the role of bottom or the receptive role, and his rippling musculature shows off this crescent. And it was kind of interesting that because not only is he performing a kind of Arab drag here, but he's also eroticizing religion and eroticizing taboos surrounding religion. So that's kind of another common stereotype, is that the best way to sort of unsettle or anger or perturb an Arab or Muslim person is to sexualize them, homosexualize them, or talk about their sexuality in public, right? So he incarnated kind of, his first role was for a studio that I should explain a little bit, a studio called Cité. The Cité referred to usually to social housing and social housing projects, and Beur is backslang Madeleine for Arab. And they specialize in what they call, they translated everything that they have into English. So the website is really bilingual. And the way that they translate Rakai is actually Black and Arab street guys, which is a little nicer sounding than Rakai actually. So interesting things about him. He is uncircumcised, and that usually would indicate that he is not Muslim, even though he has an Islamic name. So that, for people who are paying attention to these things in the adult film industry, there's a lot of films that showcase Arab roles, or who cast Latinos in Arab roles, or Brazilians in Arab roles, and assort this with fezzes, or like terrible, like Aladdin type kind of Halloween costume type clothes. So I was also interested in how, no matter how much he denied Arab heritage, people in interviews in gay magazines would always address him as an Arab. You must be a little bit Arab. French people are a little bit Arab. Like French people are there must be a little Arab in there. He said, I don't know, but I'm happy to think that. And I was also very interested in how he was capitalizing on a kind of pervasive stereotype about North African men, which I think Todd Shepard, you detailed very well, which is that kind of outwardly conservative exterior exists in conjunction with a sexually adventurous and potent interior. and that this kind of duality is something exciting that can be marketed to an audience. So I interviewed at one point the co-director of these films. His name is Antoine, and he was bragging to me that actually in the gay porn category in France, the Cité studio was the best-selling in Europe in 2008. So there was a huge impact, and they became very famous very quickly. Another sexuality scholar in France that I know, Maxime Salbru, interned there and learned a lot about it and the inner workings of the pornography industry. And a lot of my sort of analyses come from conversations, were started with conversations with him. So I think Sagat has a crucial importance in the way that he kind of not only commodified, but brought almost dignity and respect to a kind of street style, which was always seen as uncreative or uniform, and that is the banlieue street fashion, which is made up of many different things, but usually different kinds of athletic wear, sneakers, socks put over the sweatpants, pulled up over the sweatpants, tight leather jackets, tight flak jackets, and all kinds of self-grooming gestures, emphasizing facial hair, but also a lot of cross styles, and this one haircut which is called the tribal, which is kind of etchings that seem kind of atavistic etchings into the scalp. And in my first chapter, I talk about how those elements of street style show up in the fashion of Jean-Paul Gaultier, but were also in Vogue magazine. So he made this French Arab street style, ironically, a Caucasian man who was himself a fashion student and who worked initially in the fashion industry, was very intelligent about how he imitated these street styles and how he would market them to an outside audience. So he had this stratospheric rise with Cité, and then he became noticed by American pornography studios. I started working for studios like Raging Stallion and World of Men, and changed his ethnicity again. He did a film called Beirut where he was a Lebanese man wearing a keffiyeh in the desert somewhere, in a scene with another Iranian, with an Iranian, not another Iranian. Just so he made this street style intelligible actually to an art house audience because he himself was a performance artist and someone who worked with gay filmmakers like Bruce LaBruce, and he did a film called LA Zombie, where he appeared as a kind of gay zombie porn star who would have sex with, necrophiliac porn star. But he appeared in other contexts outside of France. And I should say, I forgot to say that when he became famous in America, he went back to his other name, his original name, François Sagat, and dropped the Azzedine moniker. And I should say, before I move on, that he is often asked about his Islamic crescent tattoo. And he had this to say about it in in an American gay weekly magazine called Beautiful, which comes out of LA. And I'll get the quote right here. So it starts right here. So he says, he's explaining the origin of his Islamic crescent tattoo. He said, it's a mix between the Turkish flag and the Tunisian or Algerian sign. I would say it's a clin d'oeil for Arabic men, a people and culture that I really love and respect, even if I was born Christian and Caucasian. I love Algerian men. They are really beautiful. I did it when I was 20 years old, in January 2000. I'm still wondering why I chose it. I did not choose it for a religious purpose. I'm not Muslim. But it is a beautiful sign, and the top of my back is a good place for it. Okay, so back to what I was saying earlier. So I wanted to talk about how, how this street style was something that was on the radar for a lot of avant-garde film directors and also performance artists. And Exhibit A is here with Stefano's film. And the storyline basically is it's a romance between two men, one who has an Arabic name and the other doesn't. His lover is called Omar, but he himself, they both live in an apartment in the banlieue. It wasn't clear to me which banlieue it was, but they were going through some relationship troubles, and Omar, his boyfriend, goes to New York City for a kind of a series of talks with Chiara Mastroianni, and while François Sagat's character stays home and kind of goes on a sex binge while his boyfriend is away. And what's interesting about the film is that it came out right after the publication of this book called Homo Ghetto, which was published by a journalist named Franck who himself later worked for Ni Pute Ni Soumise, which was an anti-sexism organization that did work for women's empowerment in the banlieue and also gay empowerment in the banlieue. But it was also thought to be very stigmatizing by residents of the quartier and the banlieue. And it also, this group served as a kind of recruiting ground for figures in the socialist party. So anyway, this book came out and detailed a very, what French people would call misérabiliste understanding of what it is like to be gay in the suburbs. What was interesting about it too is that a lot of the people who were anonymously interviewed in the book came out of anonymity to decry the way that they were portrayed by the journalists. So there was a little bit of debate when it came out. And there was another person that I document in my book, Fouad Zeraoui, who has a nightclub that caters to Black and Arab gay men, who contested some of the book's claims about how it's an inferno to live there, and that every self-respecting gay banlieusard needs to leave the banlieue and come to live in the city center. Okay, so I want to just stress that the context in which this film came out was one in which it was thought that it was impossible to be both gay and banlieusard and do it out in the open. In this film, we see the banlieue instead as a kind of paradise of sexual opportunity, a place where there are droves of young men who care about their physical appearance and who have a kind of sexual swagger, who are in the street. And François Sagat's character finds sexual opportunity after sexual opportunity and seems to do it out in the open. So one might call this fanciful or wishful thinking, but I think this film was heavily influenced by Cité Beurre and the sort of porno tropes in it to show the banlieue as a place where maybe people are discreet, there's discrétion, but if you know the codes and if you know the right language, sexual opportunities everywhere, and not just in designated gay spaces like the Marais, for instance. So I'm going to wrap up with my last example, which is it's a performance art piece that was a collaboration between the Australian filmmaker Elvis Di Fazio and François Sagat, and it's called Don't Panic, I'm Islamic. These are some stills from the film, which shows François Sagat's character cruising, wearing the requisite sweatpants, and this is what I'm going to talk about now. So, Don't Panic, I'm Islamic basically is a riff on the kind of PSA, the public service announcement that we saw on many T-shirts, and this was originally created by South Asian Muslims in London. Don't panic, I'm Islamic, kind of riffing off of those mugs, which says, don't panic and insert whatever you want there. But actually, the location for this shoot is in Western Sydney. And the PSA, or the sort of message, there's an artist statement associated with this that comes later, is about fear-mongering about Islamization of the West, and that one shouldn't be so fearful of it. So in this short video, which I'll show you, Sagat plays two roles. He has a dual role of a third-generation Arab Muslim mother and son. And I should specify that the Arabs in Western Sydney are Lebanese. So we see François Sagat showing off for the camera with a kind of the banlieusard, the French banlieusard swagger that he kind of transposes to this Western Sydney context in a kind of universalization of street style in the banlieue. And he is in many also combative, aggressive postures, kind of back to what you were saying about the aggression of Arab sexuality, but also these postures that are milked for their eroticism. So he has running shoes with loose laces, a wide beater on, fanny pack, boxing sweats, boxing attire, diamond studs, athletic shorts exposing muscular thighs, and he repeatedly pulls a gun out of his shorts with a kind of phallic emphasis and glares at the camera. But soon we notice that there's an appendage that seems out of place. It's actually a strand of hair, a hair extension. And slowly we see that the mother and son are morphing into each other. They're the same person. The mother, previously in the sequence of the short film, is smoking shisha, or hookah, another phallic object. She herself glares at the camera in another kind of aggressive way, kind of reminiscent of National Geographic covers. And she begins a kind of slow striptease that shows that she's wearing the same shoes as François Sagat, and that she's about to become her son, and they fuse into each other. So I was interested in that sequence that this filmmaker set up in this performance art piece, because it activates a lot of the porno tropes that you see in heterosexual and homosexual porno ethnique. And so the common trope in representations of veiled women is that the woman starts clothed and must be unveiled, usually by a white Frenchman who teaches her about sexual liberation and how to have an orgasm. And in the gay pornography, it's the opposite. It's all about being clothed. Anonymity is sexual. It's all about being robbed by someone whose identity you don't know, and it's about a reduction of the black and Arab man just to the phallus. So in some scenes, you don't see anything. Like the lighting is actually really terrible, and you just see the phallus and a completely naked white body. So what was interesting to me about this duality of character too was that it activated something I saw in the psychoanalysis chapter, which is that these conservative psychoanalysts were suggesting that actually in Arab families in France, mothers and sons are a team, and that mothers enable their sons, and they push them actually to be misogynistic or to be conservative, and to just have the syndrome de l'enfant roi, or be child kings, or have, not suffer authority from anyone. So it was interesting to me that in this PSA, which is suggesting, that we should all calm down about the threat of Arabs on our mores and sexuality, that a lot of these kind of toxic ideas are being circulated again, but of course, ironically, not everyone can see through the irony, right? So I look at the artist statement with the students. Maybe I can show you. I didn't keep time, I'm sorry. How am I doing?
That's a good question. I think we did. Do you have
I'm going to wrap up very
soon.
soon.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know how to launch this. The music is industrial and loud, so I'm just warning you. Oops. No, kind of stick with the video. Oh, it's playing somewhere here. Yeah, there it is. Well, while it's loading, I'll just tell you that I look at this video with my students and we discuss whether these images actually perpetuate the various stereotypes that they're trying to address, or whether they're a critique. And we can just end with a video and I'll take your questions afterwards. slideshow just for the last slide. So this, yeah. So I wanted just to tell you a little story about how I secured the rights to the cover image. So the original studio that took this picture is called Exerface, and they knew François Sexagon, and I gave them an advance copy of the book, and they were able to talk about the chapter in which he appeared. And finally, he gave his approval, but he was very reluctant originally because he didn't want to appear on the cover of a book that had the word Muslims in it, because he didn't want to represent himself as something that he's not, even though he had capitalized on that earlier in his career. So I trace a little bit of regret in that kind of creative decision. But as you can see here, he recently altered his tattoo so that it doesn't have an Islamic character anymore. It seems just more astrological. The crescent could be seen as a moon amidst other planets. So, I don't know if I would probably be giving myself too much credit to think if this brought him some exposure that he didn't want. But what's interesting about the cover is that people who are in the know, gay people who know this actor, look at this book and say, oh, scandalous, or they gasp, right? Because they know who this is. But other people who are not in that world look at this and say, oh, what a lovely cover. It's so classical. It's almost Franco-Arab. What a nice figure. It's so statuesque. Really beautiful. So it's just been interesting to monitor those reactions. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mehammed. Do you have questions for each other or points or things to exchange before we? And I have a couple of questions for you both, but maybe we can learn it to each other for a minute.
So I discovered your work with the invention of decolonization actually in Professor Dobie's class, I think, yes. And I was just curious, what was the reaction to that chapter of the book, and was there something in that reaction that caused you, what made you want to explore that subject matter more with your second book?
An excellent opportunity to talk about that chapter. Actually, I do have one chapter in the first book that is about masculinity, extreme versions of masculinity. It's particularly focused on so-called pieds noirs, the Europeans of Algeria. But more importantly, I think it's also a chapter that's very much cultural in its sources. That is, it depends heavily on this book by Pieds-Noirs, this called Français d'Algérie, and a series of other public debates, and very little or almost no government sources or archival documents per se. So yeah, that was a decision that I made because I thought that the chapter did important work, which was in part to show that the French, how this French discussion came to accept Algeria's independence without admitting that France had lost, and in particular without admitting in almost any way that there was something to the FLN's critique, and that was echoed by a very small number of people, but some of them well known. Jean-Paul Sartre, some of them, Frantz Fanon, most important. So that this, part of what I was trying to show is that they actually turned to, that one of the things that they refused to grapple with was this question of Algerian difference. That Algerians who were French citizens were making a claim that, or at least the FLN was strongly, that they could not be French, that they needed to be free. So that this chapter allowed me to focus on how this French discussion, particularly on the left, or certain parts of the left, was using pieds noirs difference. The Europeans of Algeria is wholly different, and using these tropes of extreme masculinity, hyper-virility, as emblematic of their incapacity to deal with women, of being profoundly un-French. So these Orientalist tropes and stereotypes. So that was, I had done a number of things around that project that kind of led me to that place, like different research things at NYU, and when I was with people like Jean-Pierre Rioux, who were completely unsympathetic to this project. And so I just I'd done a series of other, I dabbled in or did a few talks on different topics. So I hit upon this, the Homosexual Front for Revolutionary Action has this insane, its first manifesto is called We are more than 300, nous sommes plus que 343 salopes, nous nous sommes fait encouler par des Arabes. So we're more than 343 sluts. We have been butt-fucked by Arab men. And they're explicitly referencing this very important manifesto that came out 1 month before about women who said that they'd had an abortion, and which was of course illegal. You know, being sodomized in France at this point had no legal implications, at least since the French Revolution, but having an abortion did. So they're using this discussion. So how does it, and it turns out then that there's an incredible invocation by the femme, the femme sexuelle of the Arab man, and this question in particular of sodomy, of sexual acts, etc., that had not been addressed. Like people would talk about this. Then I did another thing on the far right in 1968, 10 years ago, in 2008, and so my idea was just I'll do something with the Algerian War, because I'm sure in the far right, because no one talks about the far right, so it'll be, and then it's all about sex. So it was an accumulation of different moments that led me to think that there was something that had coherency with it. And I ended up cutting out most of this stuff from the Algerian Revolutionary thing. There's a couple references in here, and I've put it in this other kind of collected edition. It's an edited collection I did with Kathleen about the war itself. And how did you decide? So in terms of, like, are you also grappling with ethnopsychology? I mean, how did you focus in on these psychoanalysts in particular? I mean, is that something you're like? How do you? And I like how you're kind of using this both as an object of study, and then some of the implications analytically as well.
Well, actually, it was a recommendation from Professor Sexagon, the book Colonial Madness by Richard Keller. There's discussion of ethnopsychiatry there, but there's also a lot of discussion of how the Arab Muslim is always already mad, and his madness is of a sexual nature too. And then I was trying to kind of trace what were the disciples of this École d'Alger, the ethnopsychiatric school there, what, if any, traces of that existed in modern France. And I was finding that, in contemporary France, and I was finding that a lot of these people, like, recreated themselves in the field of delinquent studies, and juvenile delinquent studies, and lack of authority studies. And then, you just keep reading. There was also work by Eric Cassin that talked about this former Minister of Culture, Michel Schneider, who had this book called Big Mother, which was talking about the French welfare state as an overbearing mother that neuters its men, and that French men don't know how to stand up for themselves, and that the bad students in this lesson are Arab men who have not gone through that kind of sexual re-education. And I think that's coming up a lot with the far right, and decrying sort of white masculine fragility and white French suicide. And if you keep killing yourself, the Arabs are going to take your place. So, yeah.
Maybe I'll ask one question about methodology. I don't want to say disciplinarity because I don't want to put either of you in a box, especially since I think you're both trying to extend the parameters of historical studies or literary studies. But I mean, in both books, there's a lot of, I guess we could call it discourse analysis, and but you're talking about different kinds of discourses, and how you detail what the chapters look like. But in your book, Todd, there was a lot of somewhat obscure journals connected to particular groups. But I guess I'm interested in the extent to which you see this as, really an analysis of discourses, figures, representations, and then how that connects to an anthropology, or where you see the limits of that. I know this is something we talked about in an earlier stage, but I think it's a question of your work as well, because there's the Arab man as a figure, but then of course there are many actual men who, one way of describing them would be that, and there would be other terms too in the society. So,
Sure. Yeah, so I attempt to avoid the anthropological. It definitely is an attention to discourse and to this discursive figure of the of the Arab man, and an attempt to explain how that works, how that has these kind of mainly two valences, one anchor that emerges and is identified and really fine-tuned by people on the far right, particularly the so-called nouvelle droite, and then this other, the heroic Algerian man, the revolutionary, the Arab Revolution, and how these intersect. There are moments where I use particularly archival sources to try to speak notably to questions of sexual violence, which I thought was really important to address this, and so I was able to get access. It's actually somewhat different. There's actually a giant problem with the Parisian police archives. It's because of concerns about French efforts to hide discussions of violence against North Africans, in particular Algerians, during the Algerian War, literally the so-called around October 61 that came around in the Papon trial, so-called in the late 90s. There's been an, I think, odd and problematic decision by the Parisian police archives to put everything having to do with so-called North Africans in the public domain, so particularly around questions of criminality. So this means that there's a complete violation of people's personal privacy, both in terms of medical terms, in terms of criminal records, etc. So this is one of the things that archival laws are meant to protect. So I think even there, however, it was difficult to get access to more extensive documentation. With the Marseille archives, I was able to get access to a lot of police discussions, and they're constantly investigating this French certainty that's proposed by first the far right, but then by a lot of popular newspapers, and many people writing in about this omnipresence of Arab sexual violence, why is nothing being done, they're attacking Arab women, so there's harassment. So they're constantly doing studies where they constantly come up with clear analyses, which is, this is false. That once you take into account the fact that the population is overwhelmingly young and male, and that almost all criminals are young men, that there's there's very little difference, but that there is, in fact, the indications are pretty clear that actually so-called people of North African origin, and I should say that the French have very, very specific statistical evidence that they use and talk about constantly about who's an Arab, who's Algerian, who's North African, etc. You hear a lot about republicanism and race blindness. They don't have statistics. The police have tons and tons of statistics. They're constantly kind of compiling and using these references to these statistics. And their evidence is clear that this is not the case. And so, I try to use some of that discussion to counterpose it with this interesting analysis by a guy in 1980 of the kind of main regional newspapers of France during 1 year around so-called immigrant criminality, which is overwhelmingly, so any time that a reference to criminality appears, then he maps out in these newspapers are immigrants involved or kind of referenced, and he wants to suggest, his basic argument is that in general, the evidence is that journalists are underplaying immigrant criminality. And if you look at the percentage of so-called immigrants in the population and in the prison population, there's less that are being reported on, except for one category, which is sexual violence, where it's more than 2 times any possible measure. So like close to 38% of all sexual crimes these newspapers are reporting. So that's an attempt to kind of do some anthropological work, some kind of archival claims about actual possibilities going on. And then I tried to, I tried to find these, what I call review perspectives. The obvious ones are these authors, these writers. And again, here I think you get a really clear sense of the limits of talking about anything real or anthropological. So that if you go to this, and this is the period of the first-person witness. So this is the era of the witness, as scholars of the Holocaust have talked about. So there's this constant injunction. Famously, Guy Spivak talks about this discussion between Deleuze and Foucault about we need to let the people speak. Editors and publishing houses are really concerned about this too, it turns out. So I kind of noted all of these books that had been published, first-person testimonials of North Africans in France in the 1970s, and almost every single one, in fact, begins with these sexualized references, and they all are either my father was beating my mother and then had sex with her, or my mother put me to sleep by rubbing my penis. So they're all using these very explicitly sexual discussions. That was odd, I thought. When you go into the editorial archives of these publishing houses, you find out that they're talking about this a lot. Because they're like, they know that people in France think that when there's a book about a North African, it's going to be sexual. And they're reassuring each other this book's going to be even more sexual. So again, the idea that people are being, this is again, Barthes or Foucaultian injunction to speak. That North African men, when they speak, so we saw this with the 3 men who wrote into the newspaper, we saw this with Qatari, you see this repeatedly, there's this kind of necessity of speaking about sex. And if they don't speak about it, they're asked about it. So again, I think it's difficult to get access to that, except I do try to map out, for example, in personal ads, how people play with these stereotypes. But so yeah, there's a real effort to kind of distance it, at the same time of remaining in a particular chronological framework, not going really much beyond 1979, and trying to focus more on the French discussion, and to, even though I really did want to pay attention to, gay authors, to feminist authors, to women, to North Africans, in particular Algerians who wrote, I didn't want to do it in ways that pretended that it was giving me access to some form of experience, but I did want to do it in ways that showed how it was in these spaces, or at least a couple of them. And I tried to suggest that with Qatari and with the letter, that people were actually able to reveal things that I saw going on analytically. But again, there's a reticence to do more than discourse.
So I'm trying to kind of remember the process for the project, but I remember earlier on in the project I was very interested in doing something more ethnographic, and I really just didn't understand disciplinary boundaries. And I kind of reined that in for a couple of reasons. One was, I think what made me want to do ethnography was that I was reading social science literature, finding it very underwhelming and frustrating, and not really portraying sort of these ethnic and sexual subcultures that I had experiences with in France, and I thought there was another story to tell. But I realized that I have to sort of curtail things a little bit and talk more about representations and figures. But I did want to do discourse analysis of social science writing and psychoanalytical writing. And I do actually, and this maybe makes me a bad student, but looking at figures as, cultural figures, doing a kind of ethnography or cultural anthropology, I guess, about important cultural figures who are creating these representations. So yeah, I have to admit that. But another thing that kind of stopped me from going more into ethnography was that I knew that someone else in this field, Denis was working on a book where he was actually interviewing men who had sex with men of Islamic or Arab background in France. And I thought, okay, he's going to do anyway, he's probably further along. I don't have to change departments. I didn't want to stop working with him. And so then I kind of just accepted that I should study representations, and I tried to learn more about cultural studies back when I was a doctoral student. But I was really also interested in how cultural events triggered events that had an impact on social reality. So films like La Squale, for instance, which talk about this phenomenon of gang rapes in the banlieue, and how that triggered kind of actual conversations, political discourse, and things like cultural events, basically. And also I was interested in how, for instance, what François Sagat is doing by popularizing real Arab street style by commodifying it, was actually creating huge demand for North African men, not only in France, but in other Arab countries, and creating a type. And creating, and in conversations just with friends in this community, there was a sort of frustration with this pornography studio, Citeba, and not with François Sagat so much, but with the studio, for mostly portraying Arab men as exclusively dominant, exclusively tops, and exclusively into interracial sex, but in a way that was about revenge or some kind of reckoning. And so people were telling me, that some of my friends were saying, this studio ruined our sex lives, basically, because no one sees us how we want to be seen. But on the other hand, there's of course other people who are more in the mold of the characters portrayed by Citeba, who enjoy the sexualization that ensues without the opportunities that ensue. But that's kind of a window just into sort of where the personal needs that I can. But yeah, I know that I am a little bit, some would say messy with my disciplinary boundaries, but I think this is about borders, it's about messy borders, and at a certain point I just, if I wanted to talk about something, I did, and I just tried to limit it the least certain point. If anyone asked me about my methodology during my mock trial interview. Yeah.
That and other eatable fantasies. Well, on that note, maybe we should open things things up to questions from anyone else.
This question for Dr. Shepard. So you mentioned the quotes in the beginning that contradict each other. You mentioned the quotes in the beginning that contradict each other. How does that not hurt movement, especially something that's clearly wrong, clearly there's a clear landslide of evidence against it?
So which quotes are you talking
about? The movie.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so I wanted to show that there was this, once the movie, the filmmaker himself was someone who was responding to what I'm identifying as this context, these attacks on this sexualization and claims about sexual perversion kind of launched at North African men in France. And it's a film that's just amazing if people get a chance to see it. There's an incredible set of different scenes where he's playing with all these different sexual stereotypes. There's a scene, for example, where a white journalist is trying to pick up these three guys at a bar, and he brings them back to his apartment, and quickly becomes clear they know what's going on, and they're kind of grappling with him and thinking, taking advantage of him, and playing with it, and having a fun time too. So that there's a whole, I think the film itself is really interesting. And then you have this, so I wanted to use that to show that there were different ways that people were using, that people who identify themselves on the left were using this figure of North African men and Algerian men in particular, Maghreb men in particular, as sexualized. Qatari, again, is kind of an outlier. It's not French, for one thing. But then on the other hand, this film itself then gets picked up and targeted by this far-right newspaper. So again, you can see that there's a back and forth here, which is something I really wanted to emphasize too. And that's something that disappears. Is to say the idea of the heroic North African men, the heroic Algerian men in particular, as a model for sexual revolution. I try to show that the feminist movement, the radical feminist movement in France, is really intrigued by the Algerian Revolution and references this as a way to think about their own situation and think about changing France and changing patriarchy. Certainly the radical gay liberation movement is really, really interested in it in ways that are, again, deeply problematic too, but also interestingly political in their efforts to think with these stereotypes. But again, proposing that the Arab man, again, in a limiting way, is a model for how to change the world for the better for, in this case, so-called homosexuals and women, is something that becomes unimaginable after the 1970s. And so it's that conversation that has disappeared. And the far right, the kind of quotes of them, this of him launching onto the figure of Arab sexuality and kind of rebutting and mocking this film, that argument is something that is really durable. But again, too, the way of the kind of the hyper-virile, which the far left, too, has embraced as a model of revolutionary manly vigor, is something that I think also contributes to the ongoing image of a very limited place that is given to kind of Arab masculinity, so-called, or increasingly Muslim masculinity in French discussions. So that's what I've tried to do with those, the contradictions there, is to show that it's a pretty broad spectrum of debate where there's radically different ideas. Some of them continue to be really present. Those are the ones that emerge on the far right. Some of them have really disappeared. Those are the ones that are on the left. Except I think they have somewhat pernicious effects afterwards.
First of all, thank you both for this very interesting and engaging lecture and conversation. I just want to ask, in light of everything that you guys had talked about, how do you guys currently see how this could currently influence the ways that the Muslim and French cultures interact, especially with the many refugees in France right now, between those two cultures?
What was the last, the what discussion? The refugees.
There's a lot to say about that. The first thing that comes to mind is, presently, I would say, there was the incident at Cologne in Germany, New Year's Eve, I think 2016, which, single-handedly really turned around the approval ratings for the Prime Minister. And that was really, I think, an important sort of event in terms of the relevance of what sexual demonization can do. Because there was documented sexual violence, but it was also kind of the numbers were exaggerated. There's a Jadaliya piece about this that goes into the exact numbers of what happened and who was arrested and what kind of people were there. And the people who were arrested were, for instance, not Syrians. They were, I believe, mostly of North African background, but that's in Germany. And so the whole focus was on Syrians in Germany, right? But also in France, there was this really big polemic with the author Mehammed Mack, who wrote, and it's interesting, the chronology, because he says that he wrote this piece called The Sexual Misery of the Arab World, first in French, but then it was first published in the New York Times. And so it's interesting how he's addressing an American audience to talk about this theme, but there was, we can talk about it, but there was a lot of pushback against this piece from academics in France of Algerian origin, and French and Algerian. Then it was perceived that Mehammed Daoud was being attacked or bullied by academics, and he renounced journalism. He said, he said, I renounced journalism, I'm just going to focus on being a writer. And there was a kind of manuel base weighed in on the conversation, so it became a pretty big deal. I mean, this topic of like sexuality in the Arab world and Muslim world and demonization, I think, is more important than we think it is. And I personally think it's important because I really think it influences elections. From municipal elections to, there's a lot of, whether it's about swimming pools and the impact of refugees on etiquette at swimming pools, or what kind of re-education is necessary in terms of sexual re-education for refugees. I mean, I think the poster you showed is pretty relevant today, and sort of current fears about that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I obviously try to show that there's this discussion that presumes that, in this case, so-called Arab men or North African men are overly sexual, overly libertine, let go, that their lusts are kind of constantly, they're freely flowing, which is very distinct from the kind of repressive man driven by sexual misery to forms of sexual violence. So this is kind of the main image that we see now. So again, what's key here, of course, is that neither of these are true of the vast majority of people, but this back and forth of these forms of stereotype I think are interesting. I try to, and one of the things I'm interested in is 1979 is the publication of, there's a set of things that happen, but one of the things that happens is Renaud Camus publishes a book called Tricks, which Roland Barthes describes as the kind of future of sex, where getting beyond treating sex as a political question. It can just be something that people have, pleasures that people have freely. Renaud Camus then gets known for this book, which is a really detailed recounting of his various sexual encounters. He's far more well known now as the propagandist and kind of theorist, so-called, of the Great Replacement theory, of the claim that North African and African, Arabo-African populations are replaced through kind of conspiracy, white populations in Europe. And he's one of the intriguing moments I also talk about in the book is that someone like him and someone like Marine Le Pen, and this whole, we reference forms of sexual nationalism, as we call it, where this claim that the Dutch or the French, there's certain forms of sexual freedom for women, for gays that are anathema to so-called Muslims, so-called Arabs, and it's only in the West that these can be protected, that certain people on the far right have used and deployed, Marine Le Pen among them. And I think that I talk about a kind of generation of 79 of the ways that, in this case, the references to the Iranian Revolution and the turn to the veiled Muslim woman as, again, the kind of primary focus, or the figure that Orientalist discussions are investing, but where there's lessons to be given to the rest of the world from the West, rather than this moment that I think is somewhat intriguing in the 60s and 70s, where you can get lessons. At least these certain people on the left are thinking this. So these debates today, that particularly on the far right, if you think of someone like Eric Zemmour, who's explicitly, he titles the central part of the French suicide, the suicide français, nous sommes tous les Dupont-Lajoie. So referencing this anti-racist film of the mid-1970s that exposes, in explicit ways, the kind of sexual fears that are used to target Algerian men, in this case, in the film itself. He's using it, of course, to say that French people have been unfairly castigated as racist, and therefore they can't speak the truth. So they're all like this petit blanc in the film. So this discussion of the Arab invasion that emerges around this, with that figure of Madeleine Dobie, something that has taken on real new force, something that's deployed today. And you see it really explicitly in the work of people like Patrick Buisson and other people that have a lot of connections, with the Steve Bannons and others in the world in this kind of so-called alt-right discussion here. et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I guess, Dr. Shepard, you just addressed this a little bit, but I guess my question is sort of a little bit about periodization, because obviously your works are in conversation with each other, and in some ways it's sort of the opposite trope at different periods, but it's also the same trope. So I guess I'm curious about, right, how you sort of drew those lines, and obviously part of that is practical reasons, but how, given that, do you kind of relate that to even what might have been going on before the sexual revolution, or what might have been going on in the 80s, since Mohammed, you started sort of in the 90s, is that right? Yeah, and also in terms of how you draw, relatedly how you draw the gender lines, because it seems to me, and especially Mohammed, the last performance piece you showed, it's kind of like, you know, the veiled woman and the garçon arabe are so much two sides of the same coin, that I'm curious what it would look like to really study those two figures together at a given period. So just any thoughts about that?
This the book has, again, strict chronology. 1962, so Algerian independence, and there is a set of arguments about how this, really on the far right, how this moment really catalyzed the deployment of sexualized stereotypes, of Orientalist, sexual Orientalist stereotypes that are useful, I think, and I try to show to the far right, at once to try to vilify not just the Algerians, but in particular the Gaullist government, the French government, for having humiliated itself. So this trope of humiliation that you referenced, I think, is very present in current discussions, notably around so-called Muslims in France, and in particular the boys. It's something that's really intensely a focus of far-right analysis or far-right proclamation. So the use of sodomitical rape, that soldiers are being constantly sodomized and raped by Algerian soldiers. This is being allowed to happen by the French government, encouraged by the French government. There's a general suggestion by the far right that the kind of right-wing government of Charles de Gaulle is deeply perverted itself. There's got to be something deviant with French manhood if this has been allowed to happen, this kind of unnatural reversal of roles, that the Arabs, who are supposed to be on the bottom, are suddenly taking the top role, taking and winning in defeating the French. So I want to kind of use that moment, but then also use 1962 as this source of inspiration. The Arab Revolution was something that could really change the world, this real example of a group of people who defeated this incredibly powerful country, this incredibly powerful, vicious army, the force of capitalism, the force of the West, etc., as a model for revolutionary discussions. 1979 turned out for me to be kind of fortuitous, in part because it's before AIDS. It's also important that before the arrival of the left in power, and this is something that I'm kind of mapping myself onto a few other people that have done interesting work. I'm thinking particularly of Jim House and Neil McMaster on October 61 in Paris, where they suggest there's actually a disappearance of really explicit references to colonial violence and to French colonial racism, notably targeting North Africans, around 1979, 1980, 1981, in the lead up to what many hope will be a Socialist Party victory. And these are displaced and replaced in many cases by the finally available, and this is a good thing, references to the Shoah, references to collaboration, which had begun to bubble up in French popular discussions and finally political discussions in the late 1970s. But these displace references to French violence in Algeria and French racism against North Africans in ways that are, of course, reassuring for the left, because those references, of course, implicate the left. And in French discussions, at least, the discussion of anti-Semitism are presumed to be either foreign to France, the Germans imposed it, or on the right, wholly on the right. So it's a very reassuring discussion. So that was fortuitous, but I do want to explicitly argue that what disappears at the end of the 70s is not the far right discussion. I think that really kind of digs in and then reemerges with great strength in more recent decades. What disappears is this heroic Arab man model. And one of the things I try to show with liberationists, gay liberationists, and with the feminist movement around questions of sexual violence and the emergence of rape as a form of violence that targets women, how these debates, and these take place particularly in 76, 77, 78, lead to a kind of abandonment of a celebration or a heroization of the Arab man as a model. They become too difficult, too complicated. This first happens among gay liberationists. I try to map this out, how this effort to think in really problematic ways but to ever to think explicitly in political ways, disappears. I mean, in gay discussions or the kind of gay media and other debates, the figure of the Arab man continues to go on, but the efforts to think of it politically and in particular to think about it historically as being deeply rooted in a history that is the imaginary of the Algerian man who's going to be the dominant sexual partner. They're going to claim, yes, this is true, but it's historical. Right? This comes from colonialism, this comes from oppression, and it also comes from sexual oppression against gay men, etc. The same thing with feminists. So this petering out then, and I think that the Iranian Revolution captures this in interesting ways, because in France, 2 weeks after the revolution takes over and kicks out the Shah, just 2 weeks after, on March 8th, 1979, that is International Women's Rights Day, there's this intense debate in France and discussion on the left about the Iranian Revolution. What it's really imposed is backwards, women are being forced to veil, and the execution of homosexuals. So again, the person that's immediately targeted in France is Michel Foucault, for having thought that there was something interesting going on here. But more generally, I think at once a crystallization of the idea, again, that the French left has lessons to give to these people. They can identify the good people in Iran. And also, of course, Iran is not Arab in a way, but it is Muslim. And so you also immediately get the reemergence of claims that the Algerian Revolution too was actually Muslim. That was very present that is not revolutionary. It was simply Islamic. That was very present during the war itself, but it kind of disappeared from French discussions. In the 60s and 70s, you see very little reference to Islam or to Muslims in these discussions. And again, so the reemergence of the Muslim woman, I think, is really, really crucial. I too was struck in the stuff that I studied by the real paucity of discussions of Arab women, of Islam writ large. So I try to reflect that, even though, of course, I also have an bias, because I'm making a claim about the role of the Arab man, which does. I try to deal with women a lot in the book. There's questions of, I talked about feminism, feminist efforts to think with the question of rape, how difficult that is, but also questions of prostitution, etc. So there's.
So the periodization I chose to start at 1982 because of the Marche des Beurs, also known as the March Against Racism and for Equality. And I was interested in sort of tracing this process of sexual demonization and backlash against it from the moment that North African Arabs started to emerge as a single unified voice and make claims of their own name and stress their demographic importance in France. So I think that's why I started there. I do talk about the 90s and the 80s in some of the chapters, but I think, yeah, maybe it's more heavily focused on 2000 and 2010s. And about gender, I didn't get to say this in the beginning, but one of kind of the theoretical interventions that I aim to sort of substantiate in the book is about non-gender virility. So what do I mean by that? So I was trying to explain how actually women and men in the banlieue are not, polar opposites, but they actually share a lot of codes. And I was specifically talking about two figures. Again, talking about representations of girl gang members and what they call the racaille gay, or the loose translation is fun with although it's not perfect. But the fact that both of them are virilized in the media as well as in social sense. So I'm thinking, for instance, of ways that even the veil is seen as a kind of masculine shell. The veil is a kind of armor in some renditions. Women who wear what I think I would call ninjas, right? And Fadela Nava in her book talks about educated Muslim women who are kind of spreading literature as les soldats du fascisme, or soldiers of green fascism, right? Green being the representative color of Islam. So I was interested in how there was that kind of virilization happening, but also I'm interested in how both straight and non-straight women were seen as virile in these Arab subcultures, but also it's more also about working class cultures and sort of the virilizations we associate with the working class. So I was saying that for instance, there was this documentary called La Cité du Mal, which can be translated as the city of evil or the city of men. where they interviewed the Franco-Arab, like women gang leaders who were leading groups of boys. And they kept trying, the announcer kept trying to make this woman admit that she was either very masculine or a garçon manqué, bonhomme, or lesbian, right? And kind of refusing to see that maybe virility is not the right word. I mean, maybe I'm definitely using virility in a non-traditional way, but that there are certain codes, ways of speaking, certain kinds of gender expressions that are assertive, loud, maybe a little in your face, that we've commonly associated with virility, but it's just a common cultural code, perhaps, and we shouldn't think about it so much in terms of gender.
I think unfortunately we're out of time, but I want to thank both of you for speaking so lucidly about your books. I think that there are a couple of copies here in some order forms if you feel that you need to have this book, both of these books, in your possession very soon. I encourage you to do that. But please join me in thanking Todd and